The encrypted phone buzzed 3 times on the mahogany desk. General Hugo Carvajal, once one of the most powerful intelligence officers in Venezuela, stared at the device as if it were a coiled viper. It was 2020, and he was sitting in a safe house in Madrid, having defected from the Maduro regime months earlier. The message on the screen was simple. Just 4 words from a former colleague still in Caracas. They heard everything. Run. Carvajal didn't need clarification. He already knew what "they" meant. The Drug Enforcement Administration, the United States government, the intelligence agencies that had spent years patiently building cases against Venezuela's ruling elite. What he hadn't fully grasped until that moment was the scope of the surveillance, the depth of the penetration, the years of methodical listening that had preceded the indictments. Within hours, the news broke publicly. The United States Department of Justice unsealed indictments against Nicolas Maduro himself, along with more than a dozen senior Venezuelan officials and military officers. The charges were staggering: narco-terrorism, conspiracy to import cocaine, possession of weapons, conspiracy to use weapons. But what truly sent shockwaves through Miraflores Palace wasn't the charges themselves. It was how the Americans had obtained their evidence. They had been listening, for years, to everything. This is the story of one of the most successful counter-narcotics intelligence operations in modern history. An operation that turned Venezuela's ruling elite into unwitting informants against themselves, and the devastating moment when they realized their most private conversations had been anything but private. To understand how the DEA managed to penetrate the highest levels of Venezuelan power, we need to go back to the early 2000s, when Venezuela first began its transformation from oil-rich democracy to authoritarian narco-state. Hugo Chavez was in power, consolidating control, purging the military and intelligence services of anyone suspected of insufficient loyalty. In that purge, he inadvertently created the perfect conditions for corruption on a scale that would eventually consume his successor's government. Chavez promoted based on loyalty rather than competence. Officers who showed absolute devotion to the Bolivarian Revolution found themselves elevated to positions controlling ports, airports, borders, and military zones. These weren't necessarily stupid men, but they were men whose primary qualification was political reliability rather than professional integrity. And political reliability, it turns out, doesn't correlate particularly well with resistance to corruption. The drug trafficking organizations operating in Colombia recognized an opportunity. Venezuelan territory offered ideal transit routes from Colombian production zones to markets in Central America, the Caribbean, and ultimately the United States. But those routes were controlled by Venezuelan military and intelligence officials. What followed was inevitable: negotiations, partnerships, profit-sharing arrangements. Venezuelan generals discovered they could make more money in a month of facilitating cocaine shipments than in a year of military salary. Initially, this corruption operated at the margins. A colonel here, a customs official there, isolated incidents that didn't necessarily implicate the highest levels of government. But corruption, like cancer, spreads. By the time Maduro inherited power in 2013, the rot had reached the very top. Cabinet ministers were taking meetings with cartel representatives. Intelligence chiefs were coordinating shipments. Military officers were providing armed escorts for cocaine convoys. The DEA watched all of this develop with a mixture of professional interest and growing alarm. Venezuela had gone from being a problematic transit country to being something much worse. A state actively partnering with drug trafficking organizations at the highest governmental levels. This wasn't corruption in the traditional sense. This was state policy. The challenge facing the DEA was straightforward in concept, but brutally difficult in execution. How do you gather evidence against the leadership of a sovereign nation that controls its own security services, monitors its own communications, and has every reason to protect itself from foreign intelligence gathering? You can't just walk into Caracas and start making arrests. You can't openly recruit informants in the presidential palace. You need a different approach. The DEA's strategy was patient, methodical, and ultimately devastating. They started at the edges with the traffickers themselves. When Colombian cartel members were arrested, DEA agents offered deals, cooperation in exchange for reduced sentences. Talk to us about your Venezuelan contacts. Tell us about the officials you paid. Describe the meetings, the arrangements, the money flows. Give us names, dates, locations. Initially, the information was fragmentary. A trafficker would mention meeting with a Venezuelan colonel at a specific hotel. Another would describe a payment made to an intelligence official. A third would reference a military airstrip used for smuggling flights. None of it was conclusive on its own, but the DEA wasn't looking for conclusions yet. They were mapping the network, identifying the players, understanding the structure. Then came the phones. In the 2010s, encrypted communications became ubiquitous among criminal organizations. Traffickers assumed that encrypted messaging apps and specialized phones would protect their communications from surveillance. And for a time, that assumption was reasonable. But the DEA, working with international partners, had capabilities that the traffickers didn't anticipate. Some of those capabilities remain classified even today, but the broad outlines are clear from court documents and public reporting. The DEA gained access to certain encrypted communication platforms, either through technical means or through cooperation with the companies operating those platforms. They identified phone numbers and user accounts associated with known traffickers. And then they discovered something remarkable. Those same communication channels were being used by Venezuelan officials. The generals and ministers thought they were being clever. They used code words for drugs, merchandise, or product. They used nicknames for each other. They avoided explicitly incriminating language when possible, but they also couldn't resist the convenience of direct communication. Planning a cocaine shipment requires coordination. You need to arrange transportation, security, payments, and timing. All of that requires communication, and every communication left a trail. The DEA operation, which eventually became known as Operation Money Badger, involved hundreds of agents and analysts working across multiple countries over nearly a decade. They weren't just listening passively, they were building a comprehensive picture of how Venezuela's narco-state actually functioned. They learned, for example, that cartel representatives would fly into Caracas on commercial flights, check into high-end hotels, and take meetings with government officials in restaurants and conference rooms. The officials weren't even particularly careful. Why would they be? They controlled the police, they controlled the airports, they controlled the surveillance systems. In their own capital, they believed themselves untouchable. But DEA informants were in those hotels. DEA surveillance was outside those restaurants. When a Colombian trafficker checked into the Euro Building Hotel and met with a Venezuelan general in the lobby bar, someone was watching. When money changed hands in a parking garage, someone was photographing license plates. When phones were used to coordinate shipments, someone was recording the metadata, tracking who called whom and when. The DEA also cultivated sources within Venezuela itself. Not high-level officials initially, but people around them. Drivers, bodyguards, mistresses, business partners. People who saw things, heard things, and could be convinced to share what they knew. Some were motivated by money, others by grudges or fear, a few by genuine disgust at what their country had become. These sources provided context that technical surveillance couldn't capture. They explained relationships. They identified who was really in charge versus who was just taking orders. They clarified which officials were true believers in the revolutionary ideology and which were simply opportunistic criminals who'd found a political cover for their operations. One particularly valuable source, according to later court testimony, was a Venezuelan businessman who'd been forced into partnership with regime officials in a money laundering operation. He hated every moment of it but couldn't refuse without endangering himself and his family. When the DEA approached him during a business trip to Panama, he didn't need much convincing. He began documenting everything: bank transfers, meeting notes, recorded conversations. He became a walking intelligence collection platform. By 2017, the DEA had amassed what they believed was sufficient evidence to support criminal charges. But there was a problem. How do you indict a sitting head of state? The legal issues were complex, the diplomatic ramifications were enormous, and there was always the risk that going public prematurely would compromise ongoing operations and put sources at risk. The DEA worked closely with prosecutors at the Southern District of New York, the same office that had successfully prosecuted major international drug cases before. Together, they refined their evidence, corroborated testimony, and built what they believed was an airtight case. But they also made a strategic decision. They would wait. They would continue collecting evidence, strengthening their case, and watching for the right moment to strike. That moment came in March of 2020, at the height of the global COVID pandemic. The timing was partially opportunistic. The chaos of the pandemic meant the indictments might receive less immediate attention, but it was also strategic. The Trump administration had concluded that Maduro's government was fundamentally illegitimate and that aggressive action was justified. The political will to indict a sitting head of state finally existed. On March 26, 2020, the Department of Justice announced the indictments. The press conference was extraordinary. Attorney General William Barr stood before cameras and methodically laid out charges against Nicolas Maduro, describing him as the leader of a narco-terrorism conspiracy that had flooded the United States with cocaine for years. The indictment named 14 other high-ranking Venezuelan officials and military officers, including the Ministers of Defense and Industries, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and multiple generals. But what made the announcement truly devastating wasn't just the charges. It was the detail. The indictment included specific dates, specific meetings, specific conversations. It described a meeting in July 2014 where Maduro allegedly discussed cocaine trafficking with cartel representatives. It referenced a conversation in April 2015 where military officers coordinated a drug shipment. It cited bank transfers, phone calls, and travel records spanning years. The message was clear. We weren't just guessing. We weren't relying on circumstantial evidence. We were there. We heard you. We documented everything. The reaction in Caracas was immediate, and according to later reports from defectors, bordered on panic. Senior officials who'd felt secure in their encrypted communications suddenly realized those communications had been compromised. Generals who'd taken meetings with traffickers realized those meetings had been monitored. Ministers who'd approved cocaine shipments understood that documentation of those approvals existed somewhere in American hands. The initial public response from the Maduro government was defiant. They called the indictments an American fabrication, an imperialist plot, a desperate attempt to justify regime change. Maduro himself appeared on state television, mocking the charges, calling them absurd. But that public bravado masked private horror. According to accounts from Venezuelan officials who later defected, the days following the indictments were chaotic. Emergency meetings were convened. Communication protocols were completely overhauled. Officials were ordered to stop using their regular phones and communication channels. Paranoia spread through the government like wildfire. Who had been compromised? What communications had been intercepted? Who might be cooperating with American investigators? The most sophisticated officials understood the real implications immediately. If the Americans had evidence of conversations from years earlier, it meant the surveillance had been ongoing and comprehensive. It wasn't a recent hack or a single informant. It was systematic penetration, spanning potentially the entire time period of their criminal activities. Everything they'd said, everyone they'd met, every transaction they'd approved, all of it potentially documented and filed in some DEA evidence locker. Some officials considered fleeing. A few did. Hugo Carvajal, the former intelligence chief, fought extradition from Spain for years before finally being sent to the United States in 2022. Others calculated that they were safer staying in Venezuela under Maduro's protection than risking arrest anywhere in the international system. At least in Caracas, surrounded by loyal security forces, they were beyond American reach. but that protection came with a cost. They were now prisoners in their own country. International travel became impossible. Even friendly nations couldn't risk harboring someone under American indictment for narco-terrorism. Bank accounts abroad were frozen. Assets in foreign jurisdictions were seized. The life of international privilege that came with being a senior Venezuelan official evaporated overnight. The indictments also had a chilling effect on the narcotics trade itself. Traffickers who'd been working with Venezuelan officials suddenly found their partners far more paranoid and difficult to deal with. Some of the implicated officials withdrew from direct involvement, trying to create plausible deniability. Others doubled down, calculating that they were already facing life in prison if caught, so they might as well continue profiting. The DEA's strategy didn't end with the indictments. They continued their intelligence collection, now with the added advantage that their targets knew they were being watched but didn't know exactly how. This created operational challenges for the Venezuelan side. Every communication was potentially compromised. Every meeting could be monitored. Every financial transaction might be traced. The psychological warfare aspect was deliberate. By revealing that they'd been listening for years, the DEA created an environment of perpetual uncertainty. Venezuelan officials had to assume that any new surveillance would be even more sophisticated than what they'd already experienced. They couldn't trust their phones, their computers, their colleagues, or even their security services, which might themselves be penetrated. This paranoia had practical effects on governance. Decision-making slowed as officials became reluctant to communicate directly. Important discussions that once happened over phone calls now required in-person meetings, which were themselves risky and time-consuming. The efficiency of the narcotics trafficking operation, such as it was, declined significantly. Shipments were delayed. Coordination became more difficult. Profits suffered. One of the most remarkable aspects of this entire operation was how the DEA managed to keep it secret for so long. Hundreds of people must have known about the surveillance. DEA agents, intelligence analysts, prosecutors, informants, technical specialists. Yet the operation didn't leak. The Venezuelan officials had no idea they were compromised until the indictments were unsealed. This operational security is a testament to how seriously American law enforcement takes these kinds of investigations. Leaking information about an ongoing operation is a federal crime, and agencies like the DEA have robust internal security measures to prevent it. Case information is compartmentalized. Access is restricted, and the people involved understand that premature disclosure could endanger sources, compromise surveillance capabilities, and destroy years of investigative work. But the secrecy also reveals something about the Venezuelan officials themselves. They were arrogant. They assumed that controlling their own territory meant they controlled their own security. They believed that encrypted communications were truly secure. They thought that their political power made them immune to foreign intelligence gathering, that arrogance made them vulnerable. In intelligence operations, the most valuable asset is often not sophisticated technology, but simple human overconfidence. People who believe they're safe take risks they wouldn't otherwise take. They say things they shouldn't say. They meet people they shouldn't meet. They document things they shouldn't document. The Venezuelan officials did all of that, and the DEA collected every bit of it. The long-term impact of these indictments on Venezuela's government has been profound. The country is now effectively an international pariah in law enforcement terms. Venezuelan officials cannot travel safely to most countries. International banks won't do business with them. Foreign companies won't invest in Venezuela for fear of being caught up in sanctions or criminal investigations. This isolation has economic consequences far beyond the narcotics trade. Venezuela's oil industry, already struggling due to mismanagement and sanctions, cannot access international technical expertise or investment. The country's infrastructure is crumbling. Basic services are failing. The currency has collapsed. And while many factors contributed to this economic catastrophe, the indictments and the isolation they created have made recovery nearly impossible. Maduro remains in power, protected by security forces whose loyalty is maintained through patronage and fear. But his government exists in a state of siege. They cannot trust their communications. They cannot trust their allies. They cannot plan beyond immediate survival. The men who once believed themselves masters of their domain now understand they're being watched, recorded, and documented every moment of every day. And the watching continues. The DEA didn't stop collecting intelligence after the indictments. If anything, they intensified their efforts. New charges have been filed against additional officials. More evidence has been gathered. The pressure continues month after month, year after year. For American law enforcement, Operation Money Badger and the resulting indictments represent a strategic success. They demonstrated that narco-states cannot operate with impunity, that sophisticated intelligence collection can penetrate even hostile governments, and that patient, methodical investigation can produce evidence sufficient to indict heads of state. But the operation also revealed the limits of indictments as a tool for regime change. Maduro is still in power. The indicted officials are still in their positions. The narcotics trafficking continues, albeit at a reduced level and with more difficulty. Indicting someone and actually bringing them to justice are two very different things when the person controls an entire national security apparatus. The DEA and the Justice Department understand this. Their strategy isn't necessarily to arrest Maduro tomorrow or next year. It's to create conditions where his government becomes increasingly dysfunctional, where officials defect rather than continue serving, where the international isolation becomes unbearable, where the Venezuelan people themselves demand change. It's a long-term strategy, and its success is far from guaranteed. But every Venezuelan official who lies awake at night wondering if their phone is tapped, every meeting that gets canceled because of security concerns, every financial transaction that gets disrupted by sanctions, all of that contributes to the pressure. Death by 1,000 cuts rather than a single decapitation strike. The story of how the DEA listened to Venezuela's leadership for years is ultimately a story about power and its illusions. Maduro and his inner circle believed they were powerful because they controlled territory, commanded armies, and could ignore laws they didn't like. They learned painfully that power in the 21st century isn't just about what you control physically. It's about information, about networks, about legitimacy in the international system. Every encrypted message they sent thinking it was secure was potentially being read by analysts in Virginia. Every phone call they made believing it was private was potentially being recorded. Every meeting they held assuming it was confidential was potentially being monitored. They had all the traditional trappings of power, palaces and motorcades and military escorts, but they'd lost control of what mattered most: information about themselves. And that loss of control was terrifying, precisely because they didn't know its full extent. What else did the Americans have? What other conversations had been intercepted? What other evidence existed? The uncertainty was almost worse than confirmed knowledge of compromise, because it meant they couldn't assess their true exposure. This is the modern face of international law enforcement: patient, technical, comprehensive, and devastating when finally revealed. The days when a dictator could simply control his own territory and ignore the outside world are gone. Every digital communication is potentially interceptable. Every financial transaction is potentially traceable. Every associate is potentially a cooperating witness. The Venezuelan officials learned this lesson the hard way. They're still learning it actually because the surveillance hasn't stopped. Every day they remain in power is another day of potential evidence collection, another day of building cases, another day of documenting crimes that might someday be prosecuted. The encrypted phone that buzzed on General Carvajal's desk in Madrid in 2020 carried a message that would haunt Venezuela's leadership for years. They heard everything. Those 4 words contained a world of meaning. They meant operational security had failed. They meant years of assumed privacy were an illusion. They meant evidence existed that could destroy careers, end freedom, and topple governments. Carvajal understood immediately what others in Caracas were just beginning to grasp. The Americans hadn't just gotten lucky with a single source or a fortunate intercept. They'd conducted a systematic, years-long intelligence operation that had penetrated the highest levels of Venezuelan power. They'd been patient, methodical, and ruthlessly effective. And now everyone knew. The generals knew. The ministers knew. The president himself knew. They'd been compromised, perhaps completely, and there was no way to undo it. The words had been spoken. The meetings had occurred. The evidence existed somewhere in American files, waiting for the moment when it would be most useful to reveal. That's the real horror of what the DEA accomplished, not just collecting the evidence, but letting the targets know it existed while keeping the full extent ambiguous. The Venezuelan officials know they're in danger, but they don't know exactly how much danger. They know they've been listened to, but they don't know what specific conversations were intercepted. They know evidence exists, but they don't know what will be revealed next. This uncertainty is paralyzing. It prevents effective governance. It creates paranoia and dysfunction. It turns the leadership against itself as everyone wonders who might be cooperating, who might be the source, who might be the weak link, and all of that serves American interest without requiring a single shot to be fired or a single soldier to be deployed. This is intelligence work as strategic warfare. Patient, technical, psychological, and ultimately more effective than conventional military power could ever be. The DEA and their partner agencies spent years listening, watching, and documenting, and when they finally revealed what they'd learned, the shock waves are still reverberating through Miraflores Palace today. Maduro's inner circle was horrified when they learned the truth, and they should be, because the listening never stopped. It continues today, tomorrow, and every day after. And everything they say, everything they do is potentially being added to files that will someday be opened, read aloud in courtrooms, and used to justify whatever comes next. That's the price of running a narco state in the digital age. You can hide from your own people, but you can't hide from the signals you broadcast into the electromagnetic spectrum. The financial trails you leave across international banking systems, or the witnesses you inadvertently create every time you involve another person in your crimes. The DEA heard everything, and worse, they're still listening.